Thick smoke rolled over a maze of chimneys, and London, sunless and grim, steadied itself for another hard day in the 19th century. A frantic man shouted into the bustling throng as a horse-drawn carriage thundered by, tension gnawing the street. A man in panic fought like a cornered animal while two others held him fast, yelling that he wouldn't let this happen to him. A knot of nervous onlookers muttered someone should have been more careful, eyes fixed on a blood-smeared curved knife clutched tight by an unseen hand. A man with eyes that seemed to glow lifted a cleaver stained dark, his steady grip and quiet presence chilling the crowd. A massive attacker loomed, blade slick with blood and fat, crimson spraying as he bore down. A blond man with a hard, confident stare leaned toward the anxious youth beside him, asking if Taepyeong could spot the greatest doctor in London up ahead. A brown-haired young man in old-fashioned clothes spoke quickly, insisting this wasn't a crime scene or an execution, this was something else entirely. A bold, slightly menacing medical professor flashed a curved surgical blade and grinned, introducing himself as Dr. Liston while screams echoed in the distance. Dr. Liston hoisted the curved knife and called out for the crowd to remember his name, just in case they ever needed the best. Taepyeong Kim, a young Asian man in formal Victorian dress, scanned the faces while a bonneted woman whispered the blade looked worn. Feeling alone, he sank deeper into his own thoughts. He had once gone by another name, Jahyok-seong. A solemn young man in a white coat stared ahead, quietly admitting he'd worked as a surgeon in 21st-century Korea. A grand hospital rose beneath a bright autumn sky, leaves drifting lazily across its entrance in afternoon light. A brain scan flickered on the monitor as a diagnostician said in a grave voice the tumor was malignant. A bespectacled doctor sat behind his desk and explained that surgery wasn't a viable option. In close-up, Jahyok-seong's mouth tightened as his words caught in the heavy silence. The veteran surgeon nodded once and said he agreed with the assessment. The young doctor in a white coat, rattled, asked how much time he had left. With a hand against his lips, the physician answered, at most, a month. The doctor added to Jahyok that cancers tend to be more aggressive at a younger age. Alone on a breakwater, he clenched his fists and cursed into the wind, the lighthouse a cold witness to his fury. Facing the endless ocean in a beige coat, he thought quietly, 38, he'd just become a hospital professor. He looked down with a faint, sad smile, stunned that hospice had even been recommended. He glanced at an XYZ hospice card and thought he hadn't even printed business cards for his new title. He admitted he had no parents, no family, and doubted anyone would mourn if he vanished. He looked back over his shoulder as a vehicle roared past, the air crackling with danger. Startled, he snapped his head around, sensing something behind him. A blinding white blast tore out from the center and swallowed everything. Even then, a desperate thought tried to hold the moment together, asking why fate kept adding new cruelties, until a baby began to cry. Hands lifted a newborn to the light, a voice praising the Heavenly Father in awe as the child wailed and a woman smiled through tears. The new mother, weeping with relief, reached for the maid and poured out her gratitude while the baby cried on. A boy in 19th-century clothes walked on, thinking he'd been granted a second life in England. Under a bright sky, a voice called out, wondering why it had to be England at all, then snapped at Monkey to pay attention. Sunlight flickered on the grass as a dark-haired youth paused mid-sentence, surprised, a book open in his hands. A foreign-looking young man stood apart, clutching his book while two locals shouted, demanding to know what he was doing there. A smug, confident lad smirked as two unseen bullies muttered he was ignoring them and threatened to start tossing rocks. The mocker told his friend he doubted the outsider could even read or understand them. A boy in a cap hurled a rock, shouting to get his attention. A hand shot out and crushed his wrist, snapping the ring clean through as shock froze his face. A blond man in formal clothes clamped down on the younger boy's wrist, halting him cold while the would-be thrower scrambled to yank free. Stepping forward, the blond man declared Joe was targeting his friend, and he wasn't about to let it continue. A harsh voice cut in from the trees, ordering every last one of them to clear out. Joseph Lister, the blond youth in fine clothes, darted a sharp glance sideways, fixing on a shape just beyond view. Passion flaring, he urged the dark-haired young man to speak up. Silence only fed the critics, while Taepyeong wondered what good his words could do. Self-conscious, Kim admitted he looked different. The blond boy answered calmly that everyone should be treated as an equal. Respectful and earnest, Kim touched his arm, and Joseph warned him not to shrug off insults so lightly. A solemn statue of the Virgin Mary watched over as he explained his Catholic parents had left Joseon for England, settling here when his mother became pregnant. A dark-haired man in a bow tie quietly praised the ship's crew, saying their teamwork truly impressed him. An English priest's support and his father's job at a wine company meant the family lived more comfortably than most. Under the tree, Taepyeong told his blonde friend he'd stayed out of trouble here thanks to a loyal and wealthy companion. Joseph suggested they drop talk of ruffians and try something new. His dark-haired friend asked if he was really sure about studying. The blonde grinned and promised he'd fetch the item right away. An antique microscope seemed to float over the shore as the two of them scrambled to free a trapped creature from the water. A shrimp burst from the foam and someone shouted, thrilled, to reel it in. At a table cluttered with plates and a curious device, the blonde announced he'd cut open the crab's back, while the dark-haired one urged patience. Inside the glass, an orange and white mass throbbed, each beat radiating a strange, stubborn life. Joseph Lister pressed his eye to the brass telescope and gasped at the sight swimming into focus. He kept peering through the brass telescope while the dark-haired companion asked if he could see the beating heart too. Kim leaned toward the microscope, thinking nothing in this world thrilled him more than this simple instrument. Brown eyes narrowed with fierce focus, and the world outside that single determined gaze fell away. Kim called out, asking if Joseph could hear him. A nervous young man clenched a fist in his jacket, barely able to say Taepyeong's name as his heartbeat thundered in his ears. Standing tall by the sea, Joseph told Kim he wanted to become a doctor. Taepyeong wondered if toying with these things every day had changed him, reminding him a shrimp's heart was nothing like a human's. Joseph, in a vest in sunlight, looked down with a small, knowing smile. Softly, the dark-haired youth invited the blonde to come with him. Joseph Lister loomed over him and demanded to know if he truly planned to enter medical school. Still stunned, Taepyeong admitted to himself he was set on becoming a doctor again, this time in the 19th century. A bright sky opened overhead as footsteps and distant hoofbeats drifted through the quiet forest. Two horse-drawn wagons rattled down the dirt road. The front wheels struck a rock and snapped clean in two. Barrels clattered as the blonde warned the shaky rider to hold tight. Couldn't have him break his neck before he became a doctor. Dressed in formal wear, Kim eyed the uneven track and muttered the road was wretched. Joseph smirked and said with dry amusement that what they were seeing was exactly what it looked like. Thoughtful and quiet, the dark-haired man said he'd never left Upton before. Kim raised his voice, insisting he needed to go to medical school, speaking straight to his father. Joseph grabbed the dark-haired youth's arm in urgency, pleading to let Taepyeong come with him. In a dim cellar, two men assured a third that Taepyeong would repay every kindness once he was a doctor. Joseph Lister's father paused, then said he saw no reason to refuse the request. Overjoyed, the blonde youth hugged the kind older man and called him his dearest friend, the best father. Smiling, Kim promised he could show them around London on the next delivery, and the room buzzed with excitement. He leaned back, wondering if it was right to accept so much generosity, remembering his parents' joy when college finally felt real. He still felt guilty taking so much, but he couldn't help looking forward to what came next. A regal statue of a crowned queen rose over the harbor as a silhouetted gentleman tipped his hat to a grand ship gliding past. On a wooden bench, he reflected he'd only lived in Upton since his reincarnation, and wondered what the big city might be like. He jerked his head to the side and gasped. Joseph Lister's father, the blonde man in a wide-brimmed hat, pointed ahead, excited, saying he'd finally spotted their destination. Kim stared, overwhelmed by the endless sprawl. This was London. In close-up, the surprise settled on him as he said aloud, this smoky, sprawling place was London. Rats scattered as a wooden cart rattled through a gray street, carrying a dark-haired man and a blonde deeper into the city's heart. Eyes wide, Taepyeong slapped a hand over his mouth, a guttural sound escaping him. The country boy reeled, beaten back by the stench, while a city man laughed that the smell was too much for him. Hand still to his mouth, he said he'd never smelled anything like this in a city. He sagged against a crumbling wall, shielding his head, thinking the streets reeked of rot. A bruised figure lunged past a chair, shouting at people to move. A dark-haired man in a suit gasped, asking if that was truly a dead body. Kim tried to slip away, but someone yanked him hard near the wagon wheel. Joseph asked if he was all right. The startled dark-haired man forced a shaky yes. The dark-haired man asked the blonde if something had happened. The blonde said he wouldn't know. A body swaddled in torn cloth hung in the air as a calm voice explained it was likely a cadaver for the London Medical School. Kim forced a thin smile and glanced away, the tension still humming. Politely, Joseph objected to the word supplied, calling it disrespectful, and mentioned UCL's skill at dissection. Anxious, the dark-haired man asked if that phrasing was just a slip. Maybe their wine delivery caused the confusion. Even so, Kim weighed it all, realizing there was another issue they needed to face. Studying the decayed corpse, Kim quietly said they shouldn't attempt a dissection in that condition. Wiping his brow, the dark-haired man muttered their subjects would die of disease before they learned a thing. A troubled onlooker stared at the covered body and wondered aloud if students would be forced to dissect that. Hand to his forehead, Taepyeong wondered if choosing medical school was really the right move. A man stepped forward holding a wooden bat, posture taut as the other man passed him braced for what came next. Joseph's father strode to the pair by the door and said they were about to see something remarkable. Eyes widening, Joseph asked where they were going once told it was time to leave. A blond man in vintage dress told the group the shopkeeper had shared news after hearing they wanted to enter medical school. A new buzz rolled through the street. A surgery was starting. People shouted for everyone to hurry. A young man in formal 19th-century clothes looked around, stunned that so many had gathered just to watch a surgery. Kim stared off to the side, worrying about the reality of surgery and the pressure of all those eyes. Under his wide hat, a blond man shot a wary glance back, baffled by words that didn't seem to belong together. Joseph's father, blond and old-fashioned in his clothes, grinned smugly, teasing that the boy from Upton might faint. An assertive hand caught a sleeve and yanked, the grip firm and the moment crackling. A confident mentor pulled the nervous youth close, alight with excitement as he promised to explain what surgery truly meant. Joseph's father lifted his gaze, voice calm, and said the glowing feathers were meant to save lives. Kim went rigid as unseen arms locked around him, and feathers drifted through charged air. The worried youth grumbled that he already understood. A masked figure lunged with a glowing dagger, and the shocked man yelled that someone was coming. Kim tried to make himself clear, insisting he hadn't finished explaining to the two men watching him. A young man, eyes full of fear, shouted he'd rather die than submit. Two men grabbed a gray-haired man, and he screamed in agony as the crowd stared. With anxious eyes, Kim leaned toward the blonde in the hat and asked if the execution was meant for the patient too. With concern, he said he'd heard they were about to perform a surgery nearby. He froze, eyes wide, caught by something he couldn't see. A wounded man screamed this could not be surgery, while four attendants pinned him to the table as the crowd watched. A man with wild, panicked eyes screamed for help, and the air tightened with fear. On the table, a patient thrashed while the crowd shouted that the surgeons had no right to lay a hand on him. Kim pressed a hand to his mouth, quietly wondering if this was what medicine looked like in the 19th century. He remembered cramming over the history of medicine, words wavering across an open book in dim light. Overworked and fed up, Kim Taepyeong tossed a book aside, muttering he'd skim old exam questions instead of truly studying. He stood with his eyes shut, silently weighing what to do next. Joseph Lister, steady and stubborn, admitted he couldn't recall the details and decided he'd examine the patient himself. A hand clamped around the battered arm, bruises blooming under the desperate grip. Kim straightened his tie, alarm flaring as he saw the cellulitis spread, the leg already turning necrotic. He watched, heart in his throat, while the crowd wrestled a man who fought the team preparing him for amputation. A man with anxious eyes looked on in shock, telling himself the rough handling was the only way to save him. Kim swept the room with a hard look, uneasy that something crucial might have just slipped by him. Across the hall, men in formal dress held their breath while Joseph Lister warned that without a ventilator or an anesthesia machine, the operation was perilous. Concern sharpening his voice, Kim asked Dr. Robert Liston when they planned to sedate the patient, as others in period clothes looked on. Joseph's father, confident in his old-world whites, replied thoughtfully that he had just the right sedative for this. A hand swept in, flashing a wine bottle, someone joking that this would be their special sedative. Joseph's father passed the bottle over with a polite nod, saying it came from their company, and the man accepted it, startled but grateful. Suddenly, a palm slapped over Dr. Robert Liston's face, stunning the famously composed surgeon. A dark-haired man, pinned and frantic, writhed while another forced a bitter mouthful past his lips and smothered his cry. Kim's breath caught, his eyes flew wide in alarm. An older gray-haired man sagged back, disoriented, a ragged sigh and a hiccup slipping out as fatigue swallowed him. He grabbed his head in horror, insisting that dosing an amputation patient with alcohol would crash his blood pressure and trigger dangerous bleeding. Amid the whispers, Kim stood tight with worry while Joseph Lister scanned the uneasy faces around them. A polished black shoe hit the floor with a sharp, echoing thud, and the room drew even tighter. A confident figure in vintage dress tipped his top hat and strode forward, two companions keeping pace behind him. He tugged the brim low with deliberate calm, authority radiating as the crowd fell silent. With a quick pivot, he snapped open a medical kit, movements brisk and practiced. A charismatic professor lifted his hand high, introducing himself as Dr. Liston of University College London Medical School. Joseph leaned to Kim, whispering that Dr. Liston was said to be London's greatest doctor, hardly a gangster. Robert Liston offered to take the case if they required, and Kim couldn't shake how much he sounded like a pitchman instead of a physician. Like a seasoned fighter, he raised a nicked blade and declared its scars the proof of years earned at the table. Kim's eye went wide, a sharp gasp slipped out. The blade gleamed dark with grime, and someone muttered if that was blood, fat, maybe even flesh clinging to it. Kim, urgent and clear, warned that a filthy instrument like that would become a breeding ground for bacteria. A man, blindsided and enraged, lurched forward as someone slammed into his back, shouting in raw disbelief. Joseph sucked in a breath as Kim suddenly pitched forward without warning. An older man with a cane loomed over them both, delivering a cold warning to remember their place. Joseph threw up a hand to block the blow, shouting for the attacker to stop. Joseph's father, voice like a gavel, told Kim and his son they were not to stir up trouble. Joseph stared, shaken, muttering that this couldn't possibly be Upton. Kim dropped his eyes, a bead of sweat sliding as his thoughts pressed down hard. Dr. Liston ordered the assistant to strip the patient's clothes, and Kim pleaded for mercy while the scissors went to work. Steel whispered through cloth close to skin, the assistant following the order without pause. Kim pinched his nose, muttering he could already smell the person beside him. He cinched the tourniquet tight around the ruined leg and stated flatly that amputation was the only way. A hand yanked a leather strap tight, while a voice burst out, no disinfectant, no gloves, none at all. Dr. Liston commanded them to bind the thigh and hold fast, his knife lifting into position. He told them to start the clock. Liston set the blade to the patient's bruised arm, steady and exact, as the room tightened around the moment. Kim's eyes widened, a lone bead of sweat tracking down his cheek. Liston drove the blade in a swift, forceful arc while the room held its breath. Blood burst into the air, spattering wide as the cut ripped through skin and tissue. Frozen in place, Kim watched in disbelief as a hand nearby carved through skin and muscle with impossible speed. Even Dr. Liston marveled in silence. Amputations that fast were rare, even in modern times. One blood-soaked figure reached out in desperation, as another man tightened his grip on a waiting cleaver. Liston slashed hard with his knife, fresh spray arcing across the room. The wounded man clutched his hand and screamed, pain erupting while blood spattered everything around him. A pocket watch ticked softly, its faint glow punctuating the hush with every beat. A lone hand lifted a book into a thin shaft of light, the stillness stark after all that chaos. In a bloodied apron, Dr. Liston tipped his hat and lifted his knife, as two top-hatted men watched in tight silence. He hoisted his saw and declared that for limbs or jaws they should send for him. Joseph Lister chimed in, boasting he could saw through anything in 30 seconds, and the crowd roared. A wooden stick jutted from a man's throat as he lay gasping, unable to force out a sound. A dark-haired young man drew a slow breath, lips parting as he steadied himself to speak. Joseph Lister glanced up and called Joseph's name, a note of surprise in his voice. He urged Kim to come with him to medical school, asking if what he'd seen had impressed him. Kim straightened, declaring that surgery was no sideshow, and he'd change everything that had just made him sick. Dr. Liston turned, welcoming Taepyeong and noting how rare it was to see a patient from the east. A menacing shape leaned over him, threatening to begin with a leg, and the words died in his throat. Shadowed hands shot toward Kim while he stammered that nothing was wrong, his voice trembling. Robert Liston lifted his tool high, and Kim cried out, begging anyone to help him. Desperate now, Kim shouted for help. He threw up his hands, rattled, as Joseph Lister watched him with tight concern. Softly, Joseph asked if he'd just woken from a bad dream. Kim stared at his own hands, baffled, muttering that none of it made sense. A carriage rolled along the riverbank while Kim exhaled, reminding himself it was only a dream, and that he and Joseph had been accepted to medical school. Dr. Robert Liston tipped his hat, saying he wouldn't be signing autographs. He'd only done his duty as a doctor. Joseph, ever the diplomat, explained that he and Kim hoped to speak with Dr. Liston about entering the London Medical School, which drew a skeptical look. Joseph's father stepped in, announcing a generous donation. Dr. Liston lit up, called the young men promising, and admitted them to London Medical School. Kim stared down at the newspaper, quietly asking himself if buying their way in could ever be right. He murmured, half to himself, why Dr. Liston seemed so delighted by the money. The two of them hauled suitcases through a cramped alley while townsfolk whispered that the greatest doctor in England couldn't possibly be poor. Joseph turned to Kim, resolute, and said this was the moment they'd waited for. A battered door marked the boarding house the school had recommended. On the grimy steps, a tiny, pixelated scrap lay abandoned, easy to miss. Kim froze, stunned by what he'd just realized about that residue, while Joseph watched him, uneasy. He heaved the suitcases up the steps, wondering if their troubles came from his heritage or from Joseph Lister's name. A weary man crumpled at Kim's feet, and from the doorway the young doctor hesitated, step in or stay put. Shaken, Kim asked if this kind of hardness was simply life in 19th-century London. The door creaked into a dim room, and a quiet voice said they'd found where they were meant to stay. Joseph noted the school had promised better, but this cramped room was all they got. Kim countered that it was worse than cramped. He eyed the filthy mattress, muttering it hadn't been washed in ages, then flinched at a rat by the hearth. Kim drew in a long, unfazed breath and pointed out the unmistakable stink drifting in from outside. His mind drifted to Upton, blue sky, clean air, the warm scent of cooking, everything this place wasn't. He fretted it might be even rougher on Joseph, who'd grown up in a far wealthier home. A blond man in vintage clothes looked down with a calm that said nothing could shake him. Joseph crouched to set a book on the floor and asked if Kim felt a spark of excitement. He told Kim this was the start of their path to becoming doctors. Looking up with his book in hand, he said they ought to open the books of their future with a bold first line. He read aloud, calling this cramped London room the very start of their dream. A confident blonde grinned, saying that was one heck of an introduction. Kim stared ahead, quietly surprised by how it landed. A faint smile touched his lips as he murmured that Joseph fit his own name better than he ever had. As night settled over the school, Kim reminded Joseph they needed to focus on not failing and to unpack before tomorrow's class. Lying awake in the shabby, rat-riddled room, he worried out loud that this place might make them ill before they even began. Clouds slid past the great dome of the London Medical School, its name seeming to echo in the distance. Sunlight poured through tall windows as several formally dressed men and one woman moved softly along the arched corridor. At the door, Joseph nodded to Kim, hand on the knob, both clutching their folders, ready to step in. The door inched open, a hard beam of light cutting into the dim hall. They stood at the front of the sunlit courtroom, books in hand, facing a silent row of expectant officials. Three men in formal wear leaned over the rail, curiosity sharpening as they peered at something just out of view. In the library, two men stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes locked on something high above the stacks. Whispers rippled through the grand room, voices asking what an Asian student like Kim was doing there. A hand slid onto the polished surface, fingers splayed with careful intent. A polite young man with a bright smile introduced himself as Joseph Lister, from Upton. He addressed the room, saying how pleased he was to join them this term. Confident now, Joseph steered the introductions and set the tone. A hostile student seized Kim's collar as others crowded close, making it clear that speaking up here had a price. Joseph cut in, introducing his reserved friend, Taepyeong Kim, but they could call him Pyong. A well-dressed young man offered a greeting and explained his parents had come from Joseon, following a priest who brought them to England. Joseph added, supportive as ever, that Pyong was English by birth, and Kim let out a startled laugh. A blond man with a confident smile stared ahead, his calm at odds with the awkward chuckles still fading. With a flick of the hand, a pompous voice mocked the notion that someone like Kim could ever call himself an Englishman. Kim sighed, admitting to himself that trouble found him no matter how quietly he tried to live. Joseph, earnest and sincere, explained that he shared their faith. An angry figure slammed a fist on the table, saying Kim's words didn't suit a gentleman. A jittery young man forced a thin smile while someone urged Joseph to let it go, nodding at the newcomer's obvious wealth. The confident blonde offered a sly smile, and Joseph Lister answered that anyone could call himself an Englishman. Every one of them was God's creation. A cutting insult hangs in the air as a dark-haired young man squares off with another student, tension crackling between them. Kim Taepyeong shouts for Joseph Lister to stop, right as an unseen figure lashes out and boots the startled medical student. A shadow falls over them. Kim grips Lister's shoulder, both men going still under the menacing presence of Dr. Robert Liston. Dr. Robert Liston demands to know what's going on, his sharp gaze sweeping the room, taking in every twitch and flinch. Kim Taepyeong and Joseph Lister seize Dr. Robert Liston and shove him back a step, the air between the three of them humming with nerves. Joseph Lister smooths the moment with a polite bow, a small gesture inviting the newcomer into the room. He bows deeper to Dr. Robert Liston, who notes mildly that the two of them have already met. Kim sits up straighter, trying to look perfectly behaved, while someone snipes that he's acting like they're back at a strict academy. Dr. Robert Liston introduces Joseph Lister and Pai-yong to the class, and Kim quietly judges Joseph for playing innocent. A bright-eyed young man steps forward, introduces himself as Colin, and warmly welcomes the new students to the department. Kim realizes Joseph's nerves aren't an act. Lister truly fears Dr. Liston, and though he dislikes him, Kim understands that fear. A firm hand presses a folder flat. The instructor orders everyone to take their seats. Class is about to begin. Dr. Robert Liston, all steel and authority, announces that regular lessons start today. He tells them he doesn't know how many of them will make it to graduation. In the packed hall, Joseph Lister sits silent and focused, knuckles tight around his quill as the weight of it all settles in. Dr. Robert Liston leans toward Kim and says if he wants to succeed, he should pray and study hard. Kim, dark hair falling into his eyes, wonders aloud if that means some of them won't be allowed to graduate. Men sit stiff and silent, faces tense. Joseph Lister clenches his fists, baffled by the anxiety gripping the room. A white sleeve lifts a piece of chalk. The instructor explains, clear and sure, that every surgeon needs a firm command of anatomy. Dr. Liston gestures at a chalk drawing, explaining how hard it is to account for every last factor in a surgery. Joseph Lister frowns, still processing, as Dr. Robert Liston calmly says sedation lets a surgeon operate without always fixating on anatomy. Liston's voice hardens. No matter how a patient is sedated, the moment a blade touches skin, they wake. A dark-haired student stares, stunned, speechless, one eye widening at what he's just learned. Alone in the dark of his thoughts, Kim Taepyeong reflects surgical sedation was routine in his past life, but here it's unfamiliar ground. He wonders if that brutal public surgery he'd witnessed happened because modern anesthesia hasn't been invented yet. Dr. Robert Liston drives it home. Once the knife is in hand, a surgeon must be swift. Hesitation mid-cut and pain alone can kill. A fist slams into the table. The voice that follows leaves no room for doubt. Memorize your anatomy. Rage flashes. Dr. Robert Liston drives his fist through a window. Glass explodes into shards. Joseph Lister trembles, quill biting his fingers, as someone barks that they'll start with the thigh or else. In the lecture hall, the stern professor sketches limbs on the board, breaking down their complexities for the silent rows. A hand maps muscle to bone in chalk, the instructor noting that limbs are simpler than most of the body. A thoughtful student raises his quill to his lips, quietly realizing the man teaching them has studied this for years. Dr. Robert Liston, eyes earnest, lifts a finger and admits he hadn't expected such gentleness from someone he once thought dangerous. He motions for them to follow, time to test theory with practice, and asks if that cotton is what he thinks it is. Wood creaks underfoot as Kim leads the group downstairs, marveling they're dissecting on day one. Kim, a doctor out of his own century, clamps a hand over his mouth, fighting the sudden urge to vomit. Smoke curls toward the closed double doors. Someone wonders aloud about the strange, heavy smell filling the hall. Dr. Robert Liston tells Kim to stuff cotton in his nostrils if the stench is new to him. Kim nods, quiet and pale. Dim light skims three men bent over a body, while a shadow slips through the entrance of the dissection room. Joseph Lister murmurs that this place is cleaner than most rooms used for dissection. Kim gags again, saying he can't believe how filthy it is, or that formalin hasn't even been invented. Dr. Robert Liston calls everyone over, voice urgent, as he pulls back the sheet and reveals a decomposing cadaver. Someone snatches another's wrist and says this is the area they studied. A blade opens the leg. The voice above it explains that legs see more operations than any other part. Kim, a doctor from the 21st century, freezes. Someone just grabbed a rotting corpse with bare hands. Under his breath, Kim mutters that the place is crawling with germs. He looks rattled, sweat beating down his cheek as the room tightens with dread. Joseph Lister shakes with distress, and Kim's voice breaks as he calls his name. A wretch rings out into the empty courtyard. A single wheelbarrow sits abandoned by a locked door. Kim steadies Joseph and asks if he's all right, blurting an apology for seeming so weak. Gentle as ever, Lister tells Kim it's normal to be shaken by a first real dissection. Eyes lowered, Joseph notes that everyone else, Kim included, made it through. Kim swallows the truth of his past life and says the others simply started earlier. Someone quietly remarks that Joseph was tough just for staying conscious. An iron gate rattles open. Both Joseph and Kim whip their heads toward the sound. A student staggers out, clutching his arm. An authoritative voice orders someone to bring cloth. Kim wonders if upperclassmen are practicing dissection. Another student leans in to check a bleeding finger. Alfred waves it off. It's only a nick, nothing serious. Dr. Robert Liston tells Kim to stop the bleeding and come back when he's ready. A young man with neatly styled brown hair looks forward, nervous, muttering an apology to whoever's in front of him. Kim asks if the injury happened during dissection. The young man chuckles, his knife slipped while cutting. Kim's eyes snap wide. Joseph Lister had handled the cadaver with bare hands. Dr. Robert Liston turns grim, warning that not all of them will live to see graduation. It rattles Kim to the core. A brown-haired student grips his bleeding hand and says if he does nothing, someone's life could be in danger. In a carriage, Colin, well-dressed and thoughtful, wonders aloud if someone is actually incredibly wealthy. Quietly surprised, Kim considers that Alfred never seemed particularly remarkable. Kim, still the man out of time, asks if people really take a carriage to school. The carriage rolls up to a sprawling mansion. Someone inside says it looks fancier than anything in Hanam. A dark-haired young man glances back and says they've arrived in Kensington. Three men pause on the cobblestones. One asks where the other lives. Kim answers Kensington. Kim smiles, joking softly that he's starting to feel like an exorcist. A student quietly asks if Kim will come home with him to help cast out malignant energy. He adds that Kim can get what he needs at his house. Kim arches a brow at the mention of Joseph's place. The student thinks for a beat, then asks if anyone has strong alcohol or boiled water. Kim explains that river water worked back in Upton, but here they need at least boiled water or alcohol. A hand tugs Kim's arm in warning. The Thames is far too filthy to use. Joseph Lister reaches out, urgent, and tells the other student not to use the fountain water either. Colin, pale and hurting, asks what he should do. Kim answers calmly, rinse the wound under running water. Colin still clutches his hand, startled, insisting the malignant energy is to blame. A barefoot dangles off the bed as a student admits several classmates die every year. He blames the bad air. In a low voice, Colin says another student had practiced dissection and came away with the same kind of wound. Kim and Joseph look up, startled, as Kim quietly says he's seen those symptoms before. Colin turns aside, silent, worry etched into the set of his jaw. Serious now, Kim warns that if the condition worsens, his life is in danger. Colin presses his red, swollen hand to his chest, remembering that infection often starts just like this. Kim, urgent, tells Joseph and Colin he once saw a man die after touching a corpse in Joseon. A conflicted young man knits his brow, wondering why people scoff at curses but accept energy as science. Colin nods, surprised. It actually makes sense, he says, and he's shocked anyone truly bought it. He stares at his hand, whispering energy, trying to reconcile the word with what he feels. Kim groans inwardly. Calling germs energy stings his pride as a modern doctor. He explains that corpses give off malignant energy, and it can enter the body through open wounds. Joseph blurts out about this energy, then, still unsure, asks if that's really what Kim means. A human skeleton looms in the dark, the shape people fear when they whisper that corpses carry dangerous power. The responsibility presses hard. As a man from the 21st century, Kim tells himself he has to save him. Hands raised, Kim insists he isn't calling it a curse, struggling to defend his claim against Colin's skepticism. Colin pushes back. Are they really talking curses now? Superstition has no place in science. Kim, passionate and relentless, presses Colin for answers, silently begging his ancestors to forgive the lie he's about to spin. He explains he's from Joseon, near China, and that in his country, no one with a wounded hand is allowed to touch a corpse. A man in old-fashioned dress watches with a small smile, thinking that for someone from this era, Kim seems decent enough. Kim thinks to himself that at least Joseph Lister is listening. He isn't shutting him out. Curious, Colin asks where Kim is from. He doesn't look Indian. Lightly teasing, Kim says he'd first suspected jaundice, but now he understands what's really going on. Open and friendly, Kim tells Colin he's from the East. Colin nods, accepting that. Kim's eyes widen as it clicks. Of course, someone like him would stand out here. How does he explain this without saying germs? Who would believe a man like him? A hard voice calls for Kim to be burned. He goes still, a single bead of sweat sliding down. Flames roar. Joseph Lister, branded a heretic, shouts that invisible creatures invade the body, while a furious crowd jeers and calls him Satan. Kim points to the chalkboard and explains, decomposing corpses spread germs that infect open wounds. He adds that the bleeding worries him less. What's truly dangerous is harder to explain. Kim urges Colin to get proper treatment for the wound. Colin says the bleeding has almost stopped. Calm but cool, Colin asks if this is the newcomer's first time in the dissection room and tells him not to smile. Kim realizes the bodies aren't just decomposed. Students are handling unknown corpses with open cuts on their own hands. Colin says someone collects unclaimed bodies from hospitals, useful for their studies, but Kim presses him about where they really come from. He admits the intimidating man who delivers cadavers can be a little frightening. Kim scratches at his neck, distracted by the strange man who just passed by. Facing Colin again, the time-stranded doctor pauses as Colin apologizes for stopping him so abruptly. A sinister man in a top hat dangles a rope, chuckling about rope marks on a corpse and asking how fresh bodies keep turning up. Kim stares ahead, numb, wondering if Joseph's talk of deliveries truly matches what he just witnessed. Joseph, Kim, and Colin stand in a strained hush, each lost in his own troubling thoughts. Even so, Kim glances toward a man in old-fashioned clothes pushing a cart across the wide courtyard by the fountain. Something heavy skids and crashes out of sight, a harsh clatter that shivers through the room. A cart wheel strikes a rock with a sharp thunk, rattling the quiet and kicking up a puff of dust. Leaning over the cart, the man offers a hopeful blessing to someone just beyond view. The elderly man agrees to take only one corpse from the man in the suit, thanking him for the delivery as the cart sits between them. The man in the suit inspects the bodies and murmurs they are still warm, while the undertaker confirms their freshness with a sly smile beneath his hat. A firm hand slaps the cart. Someone announces they've brought good bodies for the professor today. A man in dark clothes pushes a wooden cart draped in white through the quiet courtyard, his steps hushed beneath the looming stone arches. Golden light spilled through the tall windows as four men gathered in a lavish room, each falling quiet while they took in the grandeur. A dark-haired young man tilted his head back, stunned by the sheer luxury, while someone remarked that even Joseph Lister had been amazed by this place. A well-dressed young man spoke with confidence, explaining that all his older brothers had gone into business, while he alone chose medicine. Weighing the weight of family expectations, Taepyeong Kim noted that even the wealthy younger sons still had to cut their own path. Colin introduced his fellow students in the elegant room, then added under his breath that law would have been an easier life. Colin, earnest and proud, told the group that Taepyeong Kim had come from Joseon and now risked his life to study medicine here. A tense hand clutched a crumpled cloth, knuckles bone-white and frozen in the dim light. Jaw set, Taepyeong Kim said nothing, the quiet resolve in his eyes sharpening. With urgency and precision, Taepyeong instructed Joseph Lister to quickly prepare the items he'd asked for earlier. He grimaced and said they needed boiling water, disgusted by the filthy pot in his hands. Fastidious and unflinching, he ordered the two shocked women to scrub the pot clean and boil it again, because even the water pot was contaminated. Watching closely from the side, he listened as the women explained they had to let the boiled water cool before using it. Meanwhile, someone announced they'd prepare the alcohol. Taepyeong carefully lifted the lid and peered into the steaming pot, curiosity sharpening his focus as he checked what was inside. Steam rose off the boiling alcohol as he calmly explained they'd collect the condensation gathering in the steel bowl above. He told them this simple distillation would give them stronger alcohol than usual, though it wouldn't be completely pure. Curious and intent, Colin leaned in and asked where Taepyeong had learned skills like that. Answering Joseph's question, Taepyeong said they were in Joseon, his voice level against a backdrop of distant mountains and a rising red sun. Amazed and intrigued, Joseph Lister said Joseon was a remarkable nation, and Taepyeong met the praise with measured silence. Steady and reassuring, Taepyeong told them he'd clean the wound with alcohol and warned it would sting. He seized Colin by the arm and Joseph, nervous, promised he'd try his best to endure. Taepyeong worked over Colin's injured hand with urgent, firm strokes, and Colin screamed from the floor. A scream tore through the air outside, bouncing off brick walls and pulling startled eyes to the partly cloudy sky. Under the strain, Taepyeong's injured hand trembled, sweat beading as the pressure of the moment closed in. Knowledgeable and calm, Joseph explained the pain would be sharp and the area might go numb, which made Taepyeong ask why. Reflective, he answered that alcohol would kill surrounding tissue, then wondered aloud if he sounded like the son of Satan. He warned that the malevolent energy would consume them, and Colin and the two maids recoiled at his words. Thoughtful and focused, he considered that rubbing alcohol might disinfect a wound, but could also damage the tissue beneath. A dark-haired young man weighed the grim truth, thinking that for Alfred, survival truly hung in the balance. At the table, Colin said daily cleansing was necessary, and Taepyeong questioned whether it really had to be every day. Colin let out a strained groan, worry tightening his face as he searched for what to do next. Taepyeong asked Joseph and Colin if they'd consider staying to help treat the condition, leaving both of them stunned. He wondered aloud if he could really trade that rat-infested, shabby room for a grand home in Kensington. With a bright grin, Taepyeong raised his fist and promised he'd keep treating the injury as many times as it took. Cautious but considerate, Colin said 2 weeks would be safest, and Taepyeong thanked him with clear relief. A grand brick mansion glowed at dusk as someone welcomed Joseph and Taepyeong inside, urging them to settle into the spare rooms. Hands on his hips, Taepyeong walked slowly down the elegant hallway, quietly wishing this arrangement could last. He paused over a Goryeo celadon vase on the table, noting it was a national treasure, and wondered why Alfred's family had it. He glanced upward, startled, a quiet question slipping out before he could stop it. On the red carpet, a beige stone pulsed softly, its glow casting strange shadows between two ornate urns. He picked up a lump of unprocessed rubber, wondering aloud why something like that would be here. Alfred explained that his father had probably brought it back as a sample, and then forgot it. Joseph, the wealthy medical student, told Colin he'd only asked out of curiosity. Alfred had no idea what the item was for. Studying the rubber, Taepyeong wondered quietly if rubber had finally arrived here. He considered aloud that with rubber they could make essentials, like surgical gloves. Inquisitive and alert, Joseph asked what Taepyeong meant earlier about learning things in Joseon. Stunned, Taepyeong heard someone say he'd been born in Upton and had never left. A hesitant blonde man shifted his weight, then began to explain something quietly to Joseph. Joseph lowered his eyes, silent, lost in unspoken questions. After a beat, Taepyeong told them to forget it. Joseph, blonde and steady, brushed it off, saying he'd heard strange things ever since they were boys. Taepyeong urged Joseph to get up, and Joseph, bleeding and terrified, asked if he was going to die. A young Joseph sat on the ground, clutching a scraped knee as an unseen person gently reached out a hand. Kneeling by the stream, Joseph told Taepyeong they should wash the wound and wished for ointment. Taepyeong asked what he meant. Calmly, Taepyeong said the scrape only looked serious and reassured the injured person it would heal quickly with proper care. Level-headed, Joseph told him not to panic and to examine his wound properly next time. Eyes closed, Taepyeong grinned as sunlight filtered through leaves, a soft warmth easing across his face. Compassionate and steady, Joseph promised the unseen patient that any injury could be fixed. Joseph fell quiet, looking down, his gentle features thoughtful as he reflected. He laid a reassuring hand on Taepyeong's shoulder and said he trusted there were good reasons for what Taepyeong had said. He added that if any help was needed, he should ask. Taepyeong looked upward, hope flickering as quiet resolve settled in. In the ornate room, a hesitant man asked if he could speak with Taepyeong and Joseph in private. Colin, brown-haired and pale, stared at his bleeding hand and muttered that something was wrong with it. Studying the swollen wound, Taepyeong said it looked just like the fatal injury his friend once had. Shaken, Colin said it resembled what happened to his deceased friend, and Taepyeong quietly acknowledged the gravity of it. Reaching out, Taepyeong demanded to see Colin's hand, while Colin clutched his head and asked if he was going to die. Restless, the dark-haired young man paced, insisting there was still so much he needed to do. Joseph locked Colin from behind in a chokehold, and Colin gasped out thanks through his teeth. Taepyeong pressed on the injured finger, and the patient cried out in pain. Joseph pressed into the infected spot on Colin's neck, saying the pain meant the infection was serious and getting worse. Pensive, Taepyeong reflected that in this era, there were no antibiotics to make infections easy to treat. He shoved up his sleeve and urgently demanded someone bring him a knife. From behind, Joseph held Colin protectively, both of them rattled. Colin recoiled and stammered that they were really going to amputate with a knife. Seizing Colin by the collar, Taepyeong insisted he needed a knife, while Colin begged that losing his forefinger would end his surgical career. Taepyeong ordered Colin to drag someone to the kitchen, called the person a fool, and snapped that he should have listened before the insults. He glanced at the flickering oil lamp and quietly said it had been a long time since he'd burned one. 3 servants crowded the doorway. A worried woman asked what was happening and whether the person inside was the young master's friend. Colin collapsed to the floor, wounded and desperate, whispering that he wasn't ready to give up yet. Startled, Taepyeong gripped his knife and fork and wondered aloud what on earth was going on. Now in makeshift scrubs, he called for tweezers and a scalpel, wishing under his breath for 21st-century tools. He tightened his grip on the fork and kitchen knife, admitting this was the best he could manage. A cautious figure held a clean kitchen knife and said at least the kitchen offered better tools than Dr. Liston's terrifying blade. Taepyeong ordered someone to bring the alcohol he'd prepared and asked for help holding Alfred steady, while Colin nervously questioned, restraining the young master. His voice sharpened. This was a matter of life and death. With steady hands on fork and knife, he promised to do everything he could to save Alfred's life and his finger. He raised the blade to eye level and said the next part would hurt, but not to be afraid. Colin lay on the table, drenched in sweat and wide-eyed, wondering how he was supposed to feel no fear. Taepyeong rubbed alcohol onto Colin's wound, warning he'd disinfect everything, and Colin cried out as it burned. Bracing himself, the dark-haired young man announced he'd open the wound wider to examine the damage. A fork jabbed Taepyeong's hand, and he hissed at the sudden sting. Leaning over the darker figure, he noticed with surprise that the exposed skin had a light pink hue. He studied the tissue. It should have been a vivid red, but it looked pale and lifeless, like a wilting flower. He grimaced at the stench, regretting that he'd only disinfected the surface instead of going deeper last time. He admitted he hadn't been ready for a wound caused by probing a corpse. In modern times, the police would have been called first. Overwhelmed and shaking, Colin said he was trying to endure, but the pain was almost unbearable and would only grow worse. Catching his reflection in the knife, Colin startled and asked what he was even looking at. A terrified scream ripped across the blood-slick floor as someone pressed down hard in a frantic struggle. He decided he had to cut away the rotting muscle and inflamed tissue around the swelling. Anxious but resolute, Taepyeong cut deeper to drain the last of the yellow pus, and someone cried out nearby. A blood-stained cloth spread across the wooden table as someone whispered guilt over operating without anesthesia, praying it wasn't too late. A street lamp glowed beside a brick building, pooling soft light over an empty street as evening settled. Exhausted but relieved, Joseph sagged into a vintage sofa while Taepyeong watched him in calm silence. Colin asked about Alfred, and Joseph said he was resting after wearing himself out from screaming. Concerned, Joseph asked if it was safe to leave the wound open, wondering if it should be bandaged instead. Shielding his eyes, Taepyeong explained the servant's bandages reeked, so for now it was safer to leave the wound open. Serious and intent, Joseph told him that dirty bandages would make the wound fester, and asked what actually leads to pus. Level and calm, Joseph explained that pus forms when dead white blood cells collect beneath a wound after fighting bacteria. Drained, Taepyeong leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Joseph, curiosity piqued, asked about his mention of white blood, and Taepyeong realized he'd chosen the wrong term. He explained that the body naturally fights back against harmful energy that tries to invade. A small bird-like creature hovered, as if reacting when he said the skin protects the body, unless there's a wound. Beneath the skin, he said, a defensive force battles invading energy, and the byproduct is pus. With a nervous smile, he added that this was what the people of Joseon believed, at least for now. Thoughtful and open-minded, Joseph nodded, grateful that others accepted his Joseon explanations without pressing harder. Joseph praised Taepyeong for how he'd handled everything, but Taepyeong laughed and insisted he hardly deserved the credit. Calm and reflective, he thought about the improvised surgery and quietly noted he'd used a kitchen knife instead of a scalpel. He worked carefully to finish, admitting to himself that against the odds, he'd still performed surgery. Staring at his own hands, the dark-haired young man realized his body still remembered every surgery he'd done. Sunlight brightened the grand hospital as someone wondered aloud if they could change the era even a little, and asked about observation. A stern man in formal dress told the newcomers not to interfere, only to observe quietly inside the bustling ward. Instructor Joseph Lister told the group they'd be drawing blood from a patient using a method called bloodletting.